Hello and welcome to the Boardroom. Welcome back to the Boardroom, where, as always, we are having conversations about some of the topics that are of most interest to Malta's leading business minds. We have a very important topic today, Malta's greylisting. But as always, first, if you are joining the conversation live, you're very welcome to add your questions and your comments below, and we will try to put them to our interviewees. If not, this will be streamed back on who'swho.mt, Malta's leading business portal. And now, for today's conversation, I'm going to be welcoming three guests from the FIAU, that is the Financial Intelligence Analysis Unit, the FIAU. And they're joining me to discuss the how, the what, the why, and the what's next for the very serious topic around Malta's greylisting. So allow me to welcome my guests today. They are Dr. Alexander Manjon, Head of the FIAU's Strategy, Policy and Quality Assurance, Ms. Claudia Kallus, who's Head of Supervision, and Ruth Aysop Gauchi, who is Head of the Intelligence Analysis. Welcome all of you to the Boardroom. It's great to have you on the show.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning and welcome to all our listeners.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Alex, I'm going to come to you first with a question around what is the greylisting really about, would you say, and how was this decision reached?
So thank you for that question. I would like to start off by giving a bit of context as to what is FATF, what is Manival, and what does the evaluation process entail. So practically, the FATF is the international standard setter when it comes to anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism standards, which all jurisdictions are expected to follow so that they have effective AML regimes in place. And the FATF on a regular basis carries out evaluations to ensure that jurisdictions are adhering to these international standards. Now, obviously, not every jurisdiction around the globe is an FATF member. So other jurisdictions that are not FATF members, including Malta, are evaluated by what we refer to as FATF regional style bodies, such as Manival. And Manival covers the European region. But what's important to highlight is that these evaluations, irrespective of whether they're conducted by FATF or by Manival, they're all the time conducted against the same international standard, and the same evaluation methodologies are adopted. So irrespective of who is conducting the evaluation process. These evaluation processes are routine processes, so they are carried out every approximately 4 to 6 years. So in our case, as Malta, we've been already evaluated 5 times since 1998. And the last review and the last evaluation process was conducted between 2018 and 2019, and obviously then culminated with the publication of the mutual evaluation report in September 2019. Then, depending on the results that are obtained following these evaluation visits, a follow-up process kicks into play. And the extent of the follow-up process would depend on the results that a jurisdiction obtains. In certain cases where a jurisdiction would obtain particularly negative results, as was the case of Malta way back in 2019, the jurisdiction, and in this case Malta, was not only being followed up by Manival, but FATF came into play to evaluate Malta as well. And what is also important to explain is that these evaluations have 2 main components. There is the technical component, where FATF or Manival would be evaluating the jurisdiction's laws, processes in place, and whether these are in line with international standards. And then there is the effectiveness component, during which and within which a jurisdiction is evaluated to assess whether in practice these laws are being utilized and are being put to practice. And the follow-up process of Malta, given the results obtained in 2019, entailed that Manival would focus on the technical component, while FATF would focus on the effectiveness component. And what happened in practice is that after the publication of the evaluation report, Malta was basically given a 1 year and a half observation period, within which all the recommended actions that were given to Malta as part of the mutual evaluation report had to be implemented, obviously to enhance Malta's AML CFT regime. And after this 1.5 year period, both Manival and FATF took a decision. Manival decided whether Malta had made enough progress to rectify, to remedy the technical issues, so the issues we had in our legal regime, in our internal processes, and in there we fared quite positively, so much so that Manival consented that Malta had made the necessary progress to resolve all the recommended actions in respect of the technical component. And in fact, Malta is one out of few jurisdictions, 4 or 5 jurisdictions around the world, who have no negative ratings when it comes to the technical recommendations. But on the other hand, we had the effectiveness process. So FATF decided that out of a number of 58 recommendations that Malta had to implement within this observation period, there were 3 recommended actions in respect of which Malta was not considered to have made sufficient progress. And this is what led to Malta's greylisting process. So we were given an action plan to remedy these 3 particular issues that we had in our legal regime and in our manner in which we were implementing certain practical approaches in our work. And a greylisting basically is a process whereby the FATF identifies and lists jurisdictions that are considered to have strategic deficiencies within their AML CFT systems. And jurisdictions would be engaging with the FATF, and an action plan would be drawn up on how to address these strategic deficiencies. And obviously, it's once the FATF is convinced that these strategic deficiencies have been addressed, it is when then a decision would be taken to remove the jurisdiction off this list, because these strategic deficiencies would be no longer existent and persistent.
Okay. Thank you for that very interesting introduction there, Alexander. And essentially, what I'd love to know now is, in layman's terms, in a nutshell, maybe you could explain to me why Malta was greylisted. And Alexander, I'll stay with you and come to you first on this one.
So, as I have just explained, we started off before the observation period with a package of 58 recommendations that were outlined in the mutual evaluation report that was published by Manival in 2019. And as such, we were expected to take action and carry out the necessary reforms to remedy these 58 recommended actions. And as I said, FATF was satisfied that with respect to all but 3 recommended actions, Malta had made the necessary and sufficient progress. And basically, these 3 recommended actions related to 2 particular areas, which we refer to in the FATF world as immediate outcomes. What I haven't explained is that the effectiveness evaluation is carried out against 11 pillars, 11 immediate outcomes, which would cover the entire AML CFT regime. And the 2 areas in relation to which these 3 recommended actions remain pending, which will later ended up in our action plan with FATF, related to the transparency of legal entities and tax evasion and money laundering cases and suspicions emanating from tax evasion, and the way Malta was utilizing intelligence and carrying out investigations into such type of money laundering cases. But my colleagues can perhaps provide further detail and explanations as to the detail of Malta's action plan.
Perfect. So why don't I come to you, Ruth, now, maybe for a little bit more insight then as to why Malta was greylisted. Going to ask you just to turn on your microphone, Ruth, if that's okay. Thank you.
Apologies for that. Yes, as my colleague Alex was explaining, so the evaluation process rests on 11 pillars, 11 immediate outcomes. Now, with regards to, so one of the recommended actions was in relation to immediate outcome 6. Now, immediate outcome 6 deals with the use of financial intelligence and the use of said intelligence in criminal investigations into money laundering and terrorist financing. Now, in this particular case, the reason for the greylisting was Malta was asked to give further importance and further focus on the use of financial intelligence, specifically in relation to tax crimes. And by tax crimes, I also mean specifically foreign proceeds of tax crimes. So the concern, if you like, that was communicated to Malta is that Malta is being used or could be used to launder the proceeds of foreign tax evasion within the country. And hence, one of the recommendations was to give further focus to that with regards to the use of financial intelligence. My colleague Claudia will now give further information with regards to the other recommendation on immediate outcome 5.
Sure, Claudia, it'd be great to get your insight on this as well.
Okay, so basically, as Alex was explaining, FATF had left Malta with to continue following up on 3 recommended actions. Now, 2 of these related to immediate outcome 5. Now, so just to explain what immediate outcome 5 is all about, it basically requires countries to have effective systems in place to make sure that legal persons and their arrangements, that is companies, for example, are prevented from being misused for the purpose of money laundering and terrorist financing. And apart from that, to make sure that beneficial ownership information is always available without any impediments. Now, basically, Malta has always been assessed as being at high risk of incorrect beneficial ownership information, or as beneficial ownership concealment. And this is partly because of the fact that Malta is often considered as a financial center, and as well because of the number of corporate vehicles registered in Malta. Now, when it comes to beneficial ownership concealment, this is often seen as a red flag, indicating ill intentions. So, for example, individuals might use corporate vehicles to attempt, and when I speak of corporate vehicles, I'm speaking of, for example, companies. And they would basically try to conceal the ownership of such companies in order to avoid tracing the ownership of, for example, illicitly acquired assets. And therefore, there's an attempt to try and conceal the ownership of such companies. So basically, during the evaluation process, both Moneyval and also ultimately FATF had concluded that there were few sanctions that were applied by the FIU on gatekeepers in relation to breaches of beneficial ownership information. And that ultimately raised concerns on whether Malta, as a jurisdiction, we have an adequate enforcement mechanism in relation to non-compliance with beneficial ownership information. So basically, therefore, one of the recommended actions by FATF was to apply either remedial actions or else dissuasive, effective, and proportionate sanctions whenever there are cases of non-compliance with beneficial ownership obligations by gatekeepers. Now, when I speak of gatekeepers, I'm referring to CSPs, corporate service providers, whenever they are, for example, providing services to individuals for forming companies, or as, for example, when providing directorship positions or secretary positions to such companies. So basically, there is an expectation and an obligation for CSPs to abide with beneficial ownership obligations, as basically for the purpose of ensuring that beneficial ownership information of companies is always correct and available, of course. Apart from that, there was also a similar recommended action for Malta to continue demonstrating to now the Malta Business Registry to make sure that there is accurate beneficial ownership information available at all times. And if there are instances of non-compliance with such obligations, again, sanctions are also applied as required. And that is basically what the recommended actions on IO5, immediate outcome 5, were about.
Okay, thank you, Claudia, very much. It'd be good now to understand what this meant for Malta, what this means for Malta. And perhaps, Alexander, you can give me a bit of insight into that.
So, as I have perhaps already referred to it initially, being greylisted means that a jurisdiction is recognized by the FATF to have strategic deficiencies within its AML-CFT regime. However, at the same time, FATF is recognizing that the jurisdiction is willing to remedy on these issues and has an agreed action plan with FATF to swiftly carry out the necessary reforms. But obviously, being and featuring in such a list has reputational and also economical implications. So although the FATF does not require other jurisdictions to apply enhanced measures in respect to entities or individuals that would be hailing from listed jurisdictions, many jurisdictions around the world would consider jurisdictions that feature on the list to pose a heightened risk of money laundering and funding of terrorism. And that impacts the attractiveness of the jurisdiction of our island to foreign investors. It also impacts local businesses who want to do business with international third parties and also to carry out international transactions. All of this because this listing impacts a jurisdiction's reputation. At the same time, it also has its positives. These processes, these evaluation processes, are an opportunity for the country to remedy. And through these international processes, jurisdictions are in a way pressured to ensure that the anti-money laundering realm is put on the national agenda, high up on the national agenda, which would ensure that the necessary reforms to laws, to operational practices, ensuring that entities and authorities are well resourced to carry out their operations are in place and are being sustained. So it's the right opportunity for the country to step up its actions to ensure that it has in place an effective AML-CFT regime. For us, obviously, at the FIU, it meant a lot of hard work over the past year and even more so since we've been actively reforming our operations to become more effective in our functions. And obviously, over the past year, we have stepped up further our work to ensure that we exit as swiftly as possible the greylisting process of FATF.
And why would you say that's important, Alexander?
As I said, obviously, from a reputational point of view, it is not ideal for a jurisdiction to be considered to have strategic deficiencies within its AML-CFT regime. So obviously, the swifter we manage to get out of this list, the swifter reputational concerns will keep impacting the jurisdiction as a result of this grey listing. And obviously, getting off the grey list is important to ensure that it does not impact negatively Maltese economical sectors and the attractiveness of the island to foreign investors. So obviously, it is within our plan to ensure that we do what is necessary to get off the list, the grey list, as swiftly as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Alexander. And now just to sort of go back a bit, maybe Claudia and Ruth, I'd love to hear from you what it took for Malta to arrive at this stage of having the site visit. Who'd like to sort of jump in first?
Okay, let's perhaps start from immediate outcome 5. Now, when it comes to this particular immediate outcome, there were a number of initiatives that took place in order to basically address the two recommended actions that have been put forward by during the assessment. Now, first and foremost, as a jurisdiction, we have carried out two risk assessments. One being in relation to legal persons and their arrangements at higher risk of being misused for money laundering and funding of terrorism purposes. And apart from that, further risk assessment on corporate service providers who are at a higher risk of non-adherence with beneficial ownership obligations. And why did we carry out these risk assessments? So basically, these were carried out in order to use the results of these risk assessments to devise a well-informed supervisory plan on how to monitor compliance with beneficial ownership obligations on two different levels. So first, we have started with compliance by legal persons and the arrangements themselves. And this was basically carried out through inspections by the Malta Business Registry. And then apart from that, we aimed to assess compliance by CSPs during the provision of services to companies by means of supervisory examinations by the Fiau. Now, when it comes to monitoring of compliance with beneficial ownership obligations by CSPs, this was carried out through launching a series of BO-focused thematic examinations on a number of selected CSPs that were assessed as being at a high risk of non-compliance with beneficial ownership obligations. Now, following this exercise, there were a number of CSPs where we have concluded that they are doing basically a great job. And in fact, the examination were closed there without taking any form of enforcement action, because basically they were in adherence to all their obligations. But then there were also some instances where we have required a number of CSPs to carry out some form of remedial action to address some gaps they had in their procedures to ultimately ensure that they are in compliance with beneficial ownership obligations. And then there was also a number of CSPs where we had to take as an FIAU more serious, let's say, enforcement measures. And in this respect, in fact, we have imposed a number of pecuniary fine. And the reason being that the breaches that were identified were more of a serious nature. However, basically what we did after the carrying out of the examinations, we have used the results of the thematic examinations to assess the level of compliance in Malta by gatekeepers when it comes to beneficial ownership obligations. And in fact, it was positively concluded that most CSPs are well compliant with their beneficial ownership related obligations. And in fact, whenever there were instances of non-compliance, this was limited to exceptional cases. And in fact, we did not identify any systematic breaches, neither at the individual CSP level nor in the CSP sector as a whole. And this is a very good, basically, result. And we were very happy to achieve this result. And ultimately, what I would say, I mean, the risk that legal persons and their arrangements can be used, misused basically, for money laundering or funding of terrorism, or for example, that beneficial ownership information is not correct. It can never be eliminated. The risk is always there. But the monitoring that we have carried out ultimately showed that the risk is not as high as was previously envisaged. And also the level of checks being carried out by the CSP sector is adequate enough to mitigate these risks. And of course, we have also shared the results of the thematic examinations with the CSP sector, in particular to highlight the areas for improvement. And like, for example, we have issued a number of guidance documents and also carried out a number of conferences with the private sector. And then, of course, there were also measures in relation to immediate outcome 6, which Ruth will, I think, is the best place to explain.
Perfect. Yeah, Ruth, it would be great to hear from you on that.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you, Claudia. So basically moving on to immediate outcome 6, where the focus, as we mentioned earlier, was specifically the use of intelligence in relation to tax-related matters. So basically, following the greylisting, one of the first actions which was done by Maltese authorities was to adopt a national strategy on the detection, the prevention, as well as the investigation of tax crimes and associated money laundering. Now, this national strategy was then accompanied by an action plan to address the various action points, as one of the things that we also had to be careful of is that the different authorities do not duplicate work or basically step into each other's boundaries, so to speak. So as part of this national strategy and the associated action points, a national risk assessment was drawn up. This was coordinated by the National Coordinating Committee and was based on a combination of findings from different analyses which were carried out by the different authorities. There was also a clear clarification of roles and responsibilities between the different authorities, and basically this was done so as to improve the level of exchanges of information between the various authorities and also to ensure that work is not duplicated, basically. And a task force was also set up, a dedicated task force was also set up, in which a number of different authorities participate. And this again was done so as to facilitate the sharing of information as well as the analysis of complex criminal cases and associated money laundering. So these action points, what did it all lead to in the end? So basically, as a result of these measures, we did, in fact, as a jurisdiction, note an increase in the number of tax-related and associated money laundering disseminations, both from the Fiau as well as from the Commissioner for Revenue to the police for criminal investigation. And there was also a notable increase in the use of intelligence across the board when it comes to tax-related investigations and prosecutions. I mean, these were basically the kind of results that the FATF were hoping for us to achieve, which thankfully we seem to have gotten. And that was basically it on immediate outcome 6.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. That's very interesting insight there. And Alexandra, I'd like to come to you now, please. You got to the site visit in record time, and that's interesting as well. So perhaps you can tell me a little more about that.
Thank you for that question. Perhaps first of all, it's important to explain what the on-site visit entails within the FATF greylisting procedure. So practically, an on-site mission to the jurisdiction is launched, usually at the last stages of the process, and only when the FATF evaluators are convinced that the jurisdiction would have done what is required of it to address the issues and to implement its action plan. So the fact that the on-site mission was launched in Malta is a positive step, and actually means that the FATF evaluators are convinced of the reforms done in Malta, and they are launching and have launched this on-site mission to confirm that these reforms are actually taking place, to ensure that these reforms are sustainable in nature, and also to confirm that there is the political backing to these reforms to be implemented and to be sustained. So it is quite a positive feature to have been subjected to this on-site mission in April. Why did we arrive at this stage of the on-site mission in a record time? Obviously, as I said initially, Malta did not have an extensive action plan. So as my colleagues have explained, we had practically 3 recommended actions in 2 particular areas to remedy. And it is also important to highlight the fact that we have been focusing on and implementing these reforms well before Malta entered into the Greylist procedure. So a lot of groundwork and a lot of reforms had already been happening on these same issues even well before Malta was greylisted by the FATF. But obviously this swift action is also credit to Maltese authorities and also private entities within the private sector. So as a jurisdiction and as competent authorities, we came swiftly together under the umbrella of the National Coordination Committee. As soon as Malta entered the grey list in last June 2021, immediately we started drafting an action plan as to the ways and means we were going to address these deficiencies within our system. And thanks to the coordination with other authorities, this swift action resulted into a positive appraisal by FATF. As I said, also, we saw great collaboration from the private sector. We were engaging with the private sector to come up with trends, typologies, and patterns how tax-related money laundering was happening in Malta to guide the sector as to what sort of serious cases we want them to detect. We've had private entities who were collaborating with us to help us interpret tax rules and tax laws to help boost our analytical capabilities when analyzing money laundering derived from tax evasion. So even that helped to enhance and boost our work to exit as swiftly as possible the grey list. And if Malta will manage to succeed of exiting the grey list come this June, Malta, together with Iceland, would be the jurisdiction to have exited the grey list in the swiftest time possible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Alexander. And therefore, what is next after this visit?
So what's next is that obviously we've been subject to an on-site mission by the technical evaluators, which are the technical people doing and carrying out this evaluation, with which we have regular engagements. This technical committee will be reporting to the FATF plenary, which has a specific working group to help out with the evaluation-related work. And obviously, we're expecting the proposal, let's say so, by the technical team to the plenary, and obviously then it will be up to the plenary to determine whether Malta has indeed put in place sustainable reforms that have political backing to ensure that we get off the list. Obviously, if the FATF believes that Malta requires further time to implement the necessary reforms, that would mean that we will wait for the next round, for the next plenary, that would be in October 2021. And obviously, up until then, we would keep on working hard as much as we did up till now. But we're hoping for an exit come June this year. But obviously, it will depend on the plenaries and the technical FATF evaluators' decision as to whether we exit the grey list in June or whether it will extend us to further plenaries down the line.
Okay, thank you for that insight there, Alexander. And I'm sure many members of the business community looking forward to hopeful good news in June about exiting the grey list, definitely. And so just to sort of round up our conversation today, I'd love to come to each of you in turn, just to understand what the future is going to hold for the FIAU. And Claudia, maybe we could start off with you.
So what I would say from my end, and of course this echoes as well the position of the FIAU, is that ultimately the FIAU is committed to continue carrying out the good quality work in order to, of course, not being greylisted again. Now, when we have, as a jurisdiction, implemented the 58 recommended action points as requested by the FATF, both the FIU as well as the other authorities in Malta, we have sought to implement these in a sustainable manner. And when I say sustainable, what I mean is that we sought to implement and invest in systems and practices that can contribute to continue to achieve effective results in combating money laundering and funding of terrorism in future years. In fact, when we have implemented the action plan following first the Manival evaluation process, then the FATF assessment process, and also hopefully the FATF delisting process, we have not looked at it solely as simply as a one-off tick box exercise just for the sake of addressing the recommended actions. But we have made sure that this is something that the FIU, together with the other authorities, will continue working on as a means to continue contributing Malta's AML-CFT framework, even after exiting the grey list. So it was not something solely carried out for the purpose of the FATF. Ultimately, as what I would say as an FIU, we aim to keep on doing our utmost to effectively meet the expectations of the FIU's role.
Okay, thank you very much for that insight, Claudia. And now, Ruth, over to you.
Thank you. No, I mean, building on what Claudia just explained, I mean, the evaluation process, both within Manival as well as the FATF, they were definitely learning experiences which are being used by the FIU. They have been used and are being used even moving forward, basically as an opportunity to build a stronger FIU, one that acts on having an effective mechanism with which to combat money laundering and funding of terrorism. And I mean, as a result of this, a number of initiatives have already been implemented. And we're also, again, looking to enhance these further. I mean, these are initiatives such as, for example, we've invested heavily in newly set up teams which are now dedicated to carry out a number of functions, such as, for example, teams who focus specifically on the analysis of certain predicate offences. So, for example, offences which require a more specific skill set, for example. So nowadays we've got dedicated resources for those areas. We've got, for example, distinct sectorial supervision teams, again, to conduct supervision in more specific areas, and people more dedicated to specific situations, sectors, etc. We have teams dedicated to guidance and outreach, for example, to carry out more training with reporting entities, subject persons, more outreach even to the public in general. And also, for example, teams dedicated to assisting subject persons to implement remedial action plans in the case of shortcomings which can be rectified with perhaps a bit more support. So that is, for example, with regards to the human resource element. We're also increasing training and development even to our own internal staff. I mean, this is an ongoing measure, basically, and our staff also would require continuous training and development to keep up to date with changing trends, for example, different sectors, different products which may be launched as time goes by. So there's an initiative in that area. This also comes down then to IT systems, so investment in IT systems and enhancing our IT capabilities, also to ensure that the FIU can mitigate the increases in workload, increases in the different measures that we are taking, etc. So we have a huge support system even from our IT staff. Internal quality checks, again, as an entity grows, as it takes on more responsibilities, etc., quality checks needs to be enhanced to ensure that despite the growth, the level of work being produced remains consistent and at a certain level. And then obviously, very importantly, there is the establishment of the FIU strategy. And this is something that my colleague Alex will elaborate further on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. And now finally, Alexander, I'll come to you for, yes, your thoughts on what's next for the FIAU.
So, as my colleagues have explained, we did not simply carry out an array of reforms to just please FATF, Manival, and exit the nest. We worked hard to ensure that we have an effective anti-money laundering system and that we are effective in combating serious crime through money laundering. So the level of effectiveness we have reached today as a result of these reforms and changes, which are being positively considered by FATF and other international bodies, are to us the new normality. And we want to ensure that we do not go back to the previous situation we had before all these processes start, even for the simple reason that evaluations are ongoing in nature. As I said initially, jurisdictions are reviewed every couple of years, and we are also subjected to reviews by other bodies apart from FATF and Malaga. So we want to ensure that we will never end up in a similar situation to what we are currently through. And to ensure the sustainability of the reforms we have introduced over the past months and years, we are currently this year working on a new FIU strategy, which is mapped and aligned with these international standards that I've explained earlier on that are issued by the FATF. So we want to ensure first and foremost that through this strategy, the FIU, ensures the continuous implementation of these international standards. And obviously, through this strategy, we'll be looking at better leveraging technology, editing and engineering of certain internal processes to ensure that we reduce inefficiency and as much as possible we work smarter. And we're also setting ourselves the goal within this strategy, not only that of combating money laundering and serious crime, which is obviously our legal remit, but we are making it our vision, our commitment to promote the proportionate application of anti-money laundering obligations, to promote as much as possible within the private sectors that are required to implement these laws, that rigorously the processes are indeed levied in respect to high-risk clients, but low-risk and legitimate businesses are as much as possible allowed to operate and access Maltese financial systems without unnecessary burdens that would not be risk-based. So that is also part of our commitment and something that we're looking into as how to induce, how to promote within our FIU strategy.
Okay. Well, plenty of great insight there from you, Alexander, Claudia, and Ruth. Thank you so much for being with me on the boardroom today and giving us a little bit of insight into what's next for Malta's greylisting status and obviously what's next for the FIAU. So thank you again for being on the show, and thank you to all our viewers at home, at the office. It's lovely to have you with us again on the boardroom, and we look forward to seeing you next time.